The Arizona sun doesn't just shine, it beats down. It hammers the copper-colored earth until the air itself shimmers, and it bleaches the bones of anything that can't find shade. In this land of silent, watchful mountains, a man's only real companion is his own shadow. And for 5 long years, Jackson Weatherby's shadow was all he had. His ranch was a lonely speck in that vast emptiness, built from grief and sheer stubbornness. Every line on his face told a story, but most of them were written in the last 5 years, ever since the fever took his boy, Thomas. Jackson was known in 3 counties as the best horsebreaker around, a man who could gentle a wild Mustang without breaking its spirit. They said he understood animals better than people. They weren't wrong. One morning, just as the sun cracked the horizon, Jackson stepped onto his porch. The air held a final, fleeting coolness before the day's furnace would kick on. He started toward the barn, his routine a silent ritual, when he saw it. A shape. Small and still, standing by the main gate. His hand went to the revolver on his hip, a gesture as natural as breathing. As he got closer, he saw it wasn't a threat. It was a child, an Apache boy, no older than 9, dressed in the traditional way of his people. The boy's dark eyes were fixed on him, and they held a seriousness that didn't belong on a child's face. Jackson stopped a few feet away, tense. The peace between settlers and the Apache was a fragile thing, easily broken. A lone child on his land was a question without an easy answer. The boy spoke first, his English sharp and clear. "You are Jackson Weatherby." It wasn't a question. "I have come because he sent me to you." The words just hung there in the dry air. Jackson stared at the boy, at his quiet confidence, his total lack of fear. It wasn't right. "Who sent you, boy?" Jackson's voice was rust. "Your son, Thomas." The name hit Jackson like a physical blow. He stumbled back a step, the air knocked from his lungs. Thomas. His boy. Gone 5 years. He could still see the fever burning in his son's eyes, could still feel the helplessness as he'd slipped away. The grief was a cold stone in his gut, a weight he carried every single day. "That's not possible," Jackson choked out. "My son is dead." The Apache boy just tilted his head. "Yes. He walks in the spirit world now, but he came to me in a dream." Jackson wanted to laugh, to shout, to tell the boy to get off his land with his superstitions, but he couldn't. The certainty in the child's voice was like granite. "He showed me your face," the boy continued. "He told me your name. And he told me to give you this." The boy reached into a small leather pouch at his side. He pulled out something small, something made of wood. He held it out on his open palm. Jackson's heart stopped. It was a horse. A tiny horse carved from a piece of cottonwood, its legs a little crooked, its tail too short. He'd carved it himself for Thomas's 6th birthday. It was his son's most prized possession. And 5 years ago, Jackson had placed it in Thomas's hands before he closed the coffin lid for the last time. It was impossible. It was buried 6 feet under the earth next to his wife. Yet here it was, resting in the palm of a strange Apache boy, the woods smooth and familiar against the morning light. The world tilted on its axis, and every rational thought Jackson had ever had flew apart like dust in the wind. He sank to his knees, his eyes locked on the little wooden horse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence of his world had just been shattered, and he had a terrifying feeling that the worst was yet to come. Jackson snatched the wooden horse from the boy's hand. The feel of it was a ghost on his skin, a memory so sharp it drew blood. He turned it over and over, looking for a trick, a flaw, some sign that it wasn't the real thing. But it was. He knew the nick on the left ear where his knife had slipped. He knew the clumsy way he'd carved the mane. There was no doubt. "How?" Jackson's voice was barely a whisper. "How did you get this?" "Thomas gave it to me in the dream," the boy said, his voice calm and steady. "He said you would not believe his words alone. He said the horse would make you listen." Jackson got to his feet, his mind reeling. Spirits. Visions. He'd always dismissed those as stories for the campfire. But the proof was in his hand. Solid. Real. Impossible. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Nashoda. And what else did my son tell you in this dream? Nashoda's gaze was unnervingly direct. He said a debt is coming due, and that you must be the one to pay it. A debt? Jackson didn't owe anyone a damn thing. He'd paid his debts in sweat and blood and tears. He'd built this ranch from nothing, and he'd buried his whole world in its soil. He said to stay with you, Nashoda continued, ignoring Jackson's confusion. Until the woman with sunset hair arrives, she is the one who will come to collect. A woman with sunset hair. The phrase was like something from a dime novel. It sounded like pure fantasy. But then, so did the little wooden horse he was clutching so tightly, his knuckles were white. He looked from the horse to the boy, this impossible child who stood on his land speaking for his dead son. Where are your people? Jackson asked, trying to find some solid ground. Nashoda gestured vaguely toward the eastern mountains. 3 days' walk. My grandmother knows I am here. She said if Thomas Weatherby's father turns you away, you should return. But she does not think you will. The boy's certainty was maddening. It felt like a trap. Like his choice had already been made for him by a ghost and an Apache elder. He wanted to send the boy packing, to be alone again with his grief and his silence. But the wooden horse in his hand felt like a brand. And what am I supposed to do when this woman arrives? You will protect her, Nashoda said simply. From the bad men who are hunting her. This is what Thomas showed me. Bad men. A woman on the run. It was a story as old as the territory itself, and it always, always ended in blood. Jackson had spent 5 years avoiding trouble. Now it seemed trouble was being delivered to his doorstep by a ghost. Have you eaten? Jackson asked, abruptly changing the subject. Nashoda shook his head. I can go longer if I need to. That's not what I asked. Jackson turned and walked toward the house, not looking back. He heard the boy's light, almost silent footsteps following him. Inside the kitchen, he sliced bread and cold meat, the familiar motions a small comfort in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. As they ate, Nashoda's eyes scanned everything, taking in the details of the room, of the man who lived in it. You have known much loss, the boy said, his voice soft. This makes you strong, but also alone. Thomas worries about you being alone. Hearing his son's name spoken so casually, as if he were just in the next room, sent a strange shiver down Jackson's spine. It was half comfort, half agony. He pushed his plate away, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. If you're staying, Jackson said, his voice flat, you'll need to earn your keep. There's a room off the barn. You can sleep there. But you work. I am good with horses, Nashoda said. Jackson almost snorted. Every kid in the territory claimed to be good with horses. But he led the boy out to the corral where a new paint mare, wild and mean, was pacing restlessly. That one's meaner than a rattlesnake with a toothache. Been trying to get close to her for 2 days. Nashoda didn't say a word. He just walked to the fence and began to hum. A low, strange melody that seemed to hang on the air. The mare's ears swiveled. Her pacing slowed. The boy slipped through the rails, humming that whole time, moving with a patience that was almost painful to watch. He held out his hand, and Jackson watched, stunned, as the wild horse, after a long, tense moment, stepped forward and touched her nose to his palm. She will take a saddle by the week's end, Nashoda said, not looking at Jackson. And Jackson believed him. All right, he sighed, the fight going out of him. You can stay. Until this woman shows up. If she doesn't come by the new moon, you go back to your people. She will come, Nashoda said, turning to face him. And for a second, Jackson saw something ancient in those young eyes. Thomas does not lie. That night, Jackson sat in his quiet house, the little wooden horse on the table in front of him. The world felt different now. Thinner. Like he could almost hear things on the other side. He didn't know if he was going crazy or if he was finally starting to see the world as it truly was. He picked up the horse, its wooden body a tangible link to an impossible truth. A debt was coming. and a woman with sunset hair was bringing it right to his door. The next week passed in a haze of unreality. Nashota moved about the ranch with a quiet competence that was unsettling. He mended fences, mucked out stalls, and gentled the wild horses with an almost supernatural touch. The paint mare, true to his word, was wearing a saddle by the 5th day. But it was the nights that got to Jackson. Nashota would tell stories of his people, tales of trickster coyotes and spirits that walked among the living. And Jackson, the practical man who believed only in what he could see and touch, found himself listening. "My grandmother says all people used to hear the spirits," Nashota said one evening as they mended a saddle. "But most forgot how. They chose to listen only to what their eyes could see." "And you believe all that?" Jackson asked, his voice rough. "I believe what I have seen," Nashota replied, his eyes meeting Jackson's. "I believe Thomas came to me because he knew you would need help. Whether you believe does not change what is true." There was no arguing with that logic. On the 8th day, Jackson rode into the town of Bentwood for supplies. It was a dusty collection of buildings that smelled of cheap whiskey and desperation. He was loading his wagon when he heard shouting from near the saloon. 4 men, rough-looking and armed, were cornering the local blacksmith. "We know you seen her," one of them snarled. He was a tall man with a jagged scar running down his left cheek. "Red-haired girl, about 20, traveling alone. Tell us where she went, or this conversation gets a lot less friendly." Red-haired girl. The words hit Jackson like a cold wind. Sunset hair. Nashota's prophecy echoed in his head. The new moon was only 3 days away. Jackson kept loading his wagon, slow and deliberate, but his eyes missed nothing. He memorized the men's faces, the way they carried their guns, the casual cruelty in their stances. They were professional troublemakers. Then the scarred man saw him watching. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Or maybe Jackson imagined it. The men eventually gave up and stomped back into the saloon, but the scarred man gave Jackson one last, long look before he disappeared inside. A look that felt strangely personal. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Jackson's mind racing. This was real. It wasn't just a child's dream. There was a woman, and there were men hunting her. He arrived to find Nashota waiting for him by the corral. "Saw some trouble in town," Jackson said, dismounting. 4 men, looking for a young woman with red hair." Nashota just nodded, as if Jackson were merely confirming the weather. "They are the bad men from the dream. They carry a darkness with them." Then the boy looked at Jackson, his expression grim. "Thomas showed me something else. The woman. She is not just running. She is carrying something. Something the men want back. Something that proves a great crime." A great crime. The debt Nashota had spoken of. It was all starting to connect, forming a picture that Jackson didn't like one bit. This wasn't just a runaway girl. This was something far more dangerous. He was being pulled into a fight that wasn't his, all because of a message from a ghost. "If she comes here," Jackson said, his jaw tight, "we'll deal with it then." But Jackson knew, with a sinking certainty, that then was coming. And it was coming fast. He spent the next 2 days on edge, scanning the horizon, his rifle never far from his hand. The peaceful solitude of his ranch now felt like the calm before a storm. On the afternoon of the 10th day, he saw it. A plume of dust on the eastern trail. A single rider, moving fast, pushing their horse to its absolute limit. Nashota appeared at his elbow, as silent as a shadow. "She comes," the boy whispered. Just as Thomas said. As the rider got closer, he could see the horse was stumbling with exhaustion, and on its back was a woman, her clothes torn and dusty, her hair a brilliant banner of red streaming behind her. Sunset hair. She rode straight into his yard, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, and Jackson felt the world shift under his feet. The prophecy was no longer a story. It was standing right in front of him, and the trouble was right behind her. The woman pulled her exhausted horse to a stop, its sides heaving. Up close, Jackson could see the grime and fear on her face, but underneath it, there was a strength, a fire in her green eyes that hadn't been extinguished. "Please," she gasped, her voice raspy. "I need help. There are men following me, 4 of them. They're not far behind." Her story tumbled out in a torrent of desperation. Her name was Margot Sinclair. She was running from a forced marriage, a cruel stepfather who saw her as nothing more than property. The men were hired to drag her back, and they didn't care if she was kicking and screaming when they did it. It was a plausible story, the kind of tragedy that played out all too often in the unforgiving territory. But as Jackson listened, he saw something else. He saw her gaze flicker toward the barn. He saw the way she held herself, a coiled tension that went beyond simple fear. It felt practiced, performed. "Get down," Jackson said, his voice flat. "We'll see to your horse." As she dismounted, her legs buckling, he steadied her. And that's when he saw it. On the sweaty flank of her horse, half hidden by a saddle strap, was a brand. Not a rancher's mark. It was the stylized eagle of the Transcontinental Railroad, the company run by the most powerful and ruthless baron in the territory, a man named Alistair Finch, a man known for swallowing up ranches like Jackson's for pennies on the dollar, using hired thugs to enforce his will. Nothing about this added up. Nashota led her horse away, and Margot's eyes followed him. "He's Apache," she stated, a strange note in her voice. "You trust him?" "I do," Jackson said, his eyes narrowed. "Got a problem with that?" She quickly shook her head. But the question lingered in the air between them. He led her inside, gave her food and water, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion. He was being played. This woman, her story, it was all a lie. But why? Was she a scout for the men? A trap to get him to lower his guard before they moved in? His hand drifted toward his revolver. He could end this right now. Throw her out. Let her face the consequences of whatever game she was playing. But then he remembered the wooden horse. The message from his son. Protect her. Thomas wouldn't send him into a trap. There had to be more to the story. "Those men," he said, his voice hard as iron. "They don't work for your stepfather, do they?" Margot froze, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. The color drained from her face. The mask of the frightened runaway shattered, replaced by a look of pure, cold fury. "Who are you?" she whispered. Before Jackson could answer, Nashota burst through the door, his eyes wide with urgency. "They're here, on the ridge, 4 riders, and they're not waiting for an invitation." Jackson's blood ran cold. He'd been so focused on her deception that he'd forgotten the immediate threat. He shoved a rifle into Margot's hands. "Whatever game you're playing, it's over. You want to live through the next 10 minutes, you'll do exactly as I say. Get to the window and shoot anything that moves that isn't me or the boy." Her eyes blazed, but she nodded, her hands surprisingly steady on the rifle. Jackson raced outside, the setting sun casting long, bloody shadows across the yard. The riders were coming down the ridge, slow and confident. They thought they had her cornered. They had no idea they were riding into a hornet's nest. This wasn't just about a runaway girl anymore. It was about the railroad. It was about his land. And it was about a dead boy who had, for some impossible reason, chosen Jackson to settle a debt. The first shot would come any second now. And Jackson would be ready. "You're on private property!" Jackson's voice boomed across the yard, much louder than the 4 approaching riders expected. He stood behind the stone wall of the well, his Winchester steady in his hands. "State your business or turn around." The scarred man, the same one from town, pulled his horse to a halt. He smirked, a greasy, confident expression that made Jackson's trigger finger itch. "No trouble, friend. We're just here for the girl. She's with a dangerous man, a kidnapper. We're here to rescue her." A kidnapper? The lie was so blatant, so absurd, it was almost impressive. They were trying to flip the script, to paint him as the villain. It was a classic tactic of men like Alistair Finch. Create chaos, then present yourself as the solution. "The only dangerous men I see are the ones trespassing on my land," Jackson shot back. "You have 10 seconds to ride out before I start counting in bullets." The scarred man's smirk vanished. "Wrong answer, old man." He raised his hand to signal his men, but before he could drop it, a sharp crack echoed from the barn. A stone, thrown from Nashoda's sling, struck the scarred man square on his gun hand. He howled in pain, his revolver clattering to the dust. That was the signal. Jackson fired. Not at the man, but at the ground in front of his horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider. From the house, Margot's rifle cracked, the shot kicking up dirt near another rider, forcing him to dive for cover. In seconds, their confident advance had turned into a frantic, chaotic scramble. They were pinned down. For now, the firefight was short and brutal. The riders were thugs, not soldiers. They were used to intimidating unarmed ranchers, not fighting a coordinated defense. After one of them took a bullet to the shoulder from Jackson's rifle, their nerve broke completely. Two of them scrambled onto their horses and galloped away into the twilight, leaving their wounded friend and their stunned leader behind. The scarred man got to his feet, clutching his broken hand, his face a mask of pure hatred. "This isn't over, Weatherby," he screamed, his voice raw. "Finch will have this land, and he'll have the girl. He always gets what he wants." Weatherby. He knew his name. The brief flicker of recognition in town hadn't been his imagination. This was personal. As silence fell over the yard, broken only by the groans of the wounded man, Jackson walked over to Margot, who was standing on the porch, the rifle still clutched in her hands. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear and hard. The game was up. "All right," Jackson said, his voice low and dangerous. "No more lies. Who are you? And what in God's name is going on?" Margot took a deep breath, the fight seeming to drain out of her. "My name is Margot Finch," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Alistair Finch isn't my stepfather. He's my father." The confession hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. The daughter of the most feared man in the territory was standing on his porch. "He wants more than just this land," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He's been using his railroad to run a criminal empire. Extortion, smuggling, murder. He keeps two sets of books, one for the government, and the other for himself, the real one." She looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time, he saw the truth. "I have it. The real ledger. I stole it from his safe. It has everything in it. Names, dates, payments. It's enough to send him and every man on his payroll to prison for the rest of their lives." Suddenly, it all made sense. The desperation, the professional hunters, the debt Thomas had spoken of. It wasn't Jackson's debt. It was Alistair Finch's debt to every person he'd ever wronged. And his own daughter was the one who had come to collect. "He'll never stop looking for me," Margot said, "or for that book. He'll send more men. An army, if he has to. He'll burn this whole valley to the ground to get it back." Jackson looked at the darkening plains, at the endless expanse where a man could disappear. But there was no running from a man like Finch. You either fought or you were buried. He turned back to Margot, a cold resolve settling over him. Let him send his army. Nashoda appeared beside them, his face grim. "They will come back," he said, "and they will bring fire." Jackson knew the boy was right. This was just the beginning. They had won the first battle, but the war for the ledger, for the ranch, for their very lives, was just about to start. And they were outnumbered, outgunned, and standing on the one piece of land Alistair Finch wanted most in the world. For the first time in 5 years, Jackson Weatherby had something to fight for again. And something to lose. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic preparation. They dragged the wounded man into the barn and tied him up, his hateful glares following Jackson everywhere. They reinforced the windows, barricaded the doors, and stockpiled every round of ammunition Jackson owned. The ranch, once a place of quiet grief, was being transformed into a makeshift fortress. During the work, an uneasy alliance formed between Jackson and Margot. She was no fragile city girl. She worked tirelessly, her hands quickly becoming blistered, but she never complained. She knew her way around a rifle, and her strategic mind was sharp. She saw angles and weaknesses in their defenses that Jackson had overlooked. In the quiet moments, they talked. She told him about her father, a man whose love was a cage, whose ambition had curdled into a monstrous greed that consumed everything it touched. She had lived her whole life in his shadow, a pawn in his games. Stealing the ledger wasn't just about justice. It was the only way she could ever be free. Jackson, in turn, found himself speaking of Thomas. He told her about his son's infectious laugh, his insatiable curiosity, the gaping hole his absence had left in the world. Talking about it didn't lessen the pain, but sharing it with her felt different. It was like letting a sliver of light into a room that had been dark for 5 years. "He sent the boy to you," Margot said softly one evening as they watched the sun set. "You're Thomas. He's still watching over you." Jackson didn't know what he believed anymore, but he didn't correct her. Nashota was their eyes and ears. He would disappear for hours, moving like a ghost through the surrounding hills, tracking the movements of Finch's men. On the evening of the second day, he returned with grim news. "More have arrived," he said, his face etched with worry. 10 of them now. The scarred man leads them. They are not waiting. They will come tonight. And they have torches. 10 men, against the 3 of them. The odds were impossible. A cold dread settled over Jackson. He looked at Margot, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and at Nashota, the strange, wise child sent by a ghost. He had brought them into this. He had a choice to make. He could hand over Margot and the ledger, and maybe, just maybe, Finch's men would leave him in peace. Or he could stand and fight for this woman he barely knew, for a cause that had landed on his doorstep uninvited. He thought of Thomas. He thought of the little wooden horse, which he now carried in his pocket. Protect her. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. "Let's get ready," Jackson said, his voice grim. As darkness fell, a heavy, oppressive silence descended on the ranch. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The wind died down. It was a perfect night for an attack. They took their positions. Jackson in the house, covering the front yard. Margot in the loft of the barn, her rifle covering the eastern approach. Nashota, armed with his sling and a small, sharp knife, vanished into the shadows of the corral, a silent predator waiting for the right moment. Hours passed. The silence stretched their nerves thin. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. Then, they saw it. A flicker of light on the ridge. Then another. And another. A line of torches, like angry fireflies, began to descend toward the ranch. They weren't even trying to be quiet. This wasn't an attack. It was an extermination. The scarred man, his arm in a crude sling, stepped into the edge of the torchlight, his face illuminated in the hellish glow. "Weatherby," he roared, "Finch has a final offer. Give us the girl and the book and we'll let you live. Refuse and we burn you out. We'll salt the earth so nothing ever grows here again." Jackson raised his rifle, the scarred man's chest clear in his sights. This was it, the final stand. He looked over at the barn, where Margot was a hidden silhouette. He thought of the boy somewhere in the darkness. They were all going to die here, all for a book of numbers and names. Then, the scarred man laughed, a cruel, grating sound. "You want to know something funny, Weatherby? This is all your fault. If you hadn't been so stubborn 5 years ago, none of this would have happened." 5 years ago? What was he talking about? "Finch wanted your water rights back then," the man yelled, his voice dripping with malice. "He made you a fair offer, but you refused. You were always so proud." Jackson's blood ran cold. Finch had tried to buy him out years ago. He'd forgotten all about it. "He told me to make you see reason," the scarred man sneered. "To persuade you. But your boy was always getting in the way. Always playing down by that well." The world stopped. The air left Jackson's lungs. The well. "It wasn't a fever that took your son, Weatherby," the scarred man spat, the words twisting like a knife in Jackson's gut. "It was the water, a little something I added to it on Mr. Finch's orders. We were just trying to get you off the land. The boy, he was an accident. Bad luck." A monstrous, soul-shattering understanding crashed down on Jackson. Thomas hadn't gotten sick. He'd been poisoned, murdered. His 5 years of grief were built on a lie. His son hadn't been taken by fate. He'd been taken by the greed of Alistair Finch. A rage unlike anything he had ever known erupted in Jackson's chest, a white-hot inferno that burned away all fear, all doubt, all reason. This was never about the ledger. It was never about Margot. It was always about this. This was the debt. "Now, Weatherby!" the scarred man screamed. "The girl or the fire?" Jackson lowered his rifle. He stepped out from behind the window, onto the porch, in full view of the 10 men and their torches. He stood there, exposed and unafraid. He raised his head, and a terrible, chilling smile spread across his face. "You made a mistake," Jackson said, his voice calm, but carrying across the yard with deadly clarity. "You should have burned me out 5 years ago." And then he opened fire. The world exploded in a symphony of chaos and violence. Jackson's Winchester bucked against his shoulder again and again, each shot fired with a cold, precise fury. He wasn't just defending his home anymore. He was an avenger. A ghost of vengeance risen from a 5-year grave. One of Finch's men fell, then another, their torches dropping to the ground and igniting patches of dry grass. From the barn, Margot's rifle sang its own deadly song, picking off the men who tried to flank the house. She wasn't the frightened girl on the run anymore. She was a warrior, fighting for her freedom, for the justice her father had denied the world. And from the darkness, Nashoda became a whirlwind of disruption. A stone from his sling would shatter a lantern, plunging a group of attackers into confusion. A thrown knife would cut a saddle cinch, sending a rider tumbling. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, a spirit of the night turning the hunters into the hunted. The scarred man, seeing his advantage crumble, shrieked in rage. "Burn it! Burn it all down!" The remaining men hurled their torches. One landed on the roof of the barn, another smashed through a window of the house. Flames began to lick at the dry wood, casting a terrifying, dancing light across the yard, the air filled with thick, choking smoke. Jackson was forced back inside the house, the heat searing his face. The fire was spreading fast, consuming his home, consuming his past. He could hear the flames crackling, eating away the walls that had held so much memory, so much pain. Through the smoke, he saw Margot leap from the hayloft, landing in a roll, the precious ledger tucked inside her jacket. But as she scrambled to her feet, the scarred man emerged from the chaos, his face a mask of insane fury. He ignored his broken hand and drew a knife with his good one, charging at her. Jackson raised his rifle, but the smoke was too thick. He couldn't get a clear shot without hitting Margot. He was trapped. He was going to watch her die, just like he had watched his son die. Helpless. But then, a small shape darted out of the smoke. It was Nashoda. He threw himself at the scarred man's legs with the force of a small cannonball. The man stumbled, surprised, giving Margot the second she needed. She swung her rifle like a club, cracking it across the man's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The ranch was an inferno. The barn was collapsing. The house was a roaring furnace. They were surrounded by fire, their fortress now their tomb. "This way!" Jackson yelled, grabbing Margot's arm. He knew one place the fire couldn't reach, the storm cellar. He kicked open the heavy wooden doors set into the ground behind the house, and shoved Margot and Nashoda down into the darkness. He was about to follow when he saw it. Through the flames, he saw the little wooden horse lying on the porch where it must have fallen from his pocket. The fire was just inches away. He didn't think. He ran. Back into the inferno. He snatched the small carving from the porch, the heat blistering his skin, just as the roof of the house groaned and began to collapse. He threw himself back toward the cellar, a wave of fire and smoke chasing him. He tumbled down the stairs into the cool, earthy darkness, pulling the heavy doors shut just as the world above him roared and fell into ruin. They sat in the pitch black, coughing, their lungs burning, the sound of the fire a muffled thunder above them. They had survived, but they had lost everything. "The ledger," Margot whispered, her voice trembling in the dark. "Is it safe?" She pulled it from her coat. Jackson could hear the rustle of the pages. It was safe. The proof that could bring down an empire had survived the fire. They had won. But as Jackson sat there in the dark, clutching the little wooden horse, he knew the war wasn't over. Finch was still out there. He had destroyed Jackson's home, but he hadn't destroyed him. The fire hadn't taken everything. It had burned away the past, burned away the grief, and left only a core of hard, cold purpose. He would see Alistair Finch pay for what he did. Not just for the ledger, Not just for Margot, for Thomas. When dawn broke, they pushed open the cellar doors to a scene of utter devastation. The house was a pile of smoldering ash. The barn was a blackened skeleton. The bodies of Finch's men lay where they had fallen. The only things left standing were the stone well and the corrals. Jackson's past was gone, erased by fire. He looked at the ruins, at the smoke still curling into the morning sky, and felt nothing. The grief was gone. The loneliness was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable resolve. They found the scarred man and his wounded compatriot tied up where Nashota had left them. The local sheriff, drawn by the smoke, arrived a few hours later. The story they told him was simple: attempted robbery, a fight, a fire gone out of control. The ledger was not mentioned. The sheriff, a man who had no love for Finch or his hired thugs, was more than happy to haul the men to jail and ask few questions. The news of the failed attack and the capture of his men would reach Finch soon. He would know the ledger had survived. He would come for it himself. "He won't send thugs next time," Margot said, her eyes fixed on the road leading away from the ranch. "He'll come himself, and he'll bring the law with him, bought and paid for." "We won't be here," Jackson said. He looked at Nashota. "Is there a place? A place where we can go that he can't reach us?" Nashota nodded. "My people. In the mountains. His power does not extend there. You would be safe." It was their only chance, to disappear into the Apache lands, to use the ledger to fight Finch not with guns, but with the truth. They gathered what little they had: a few horses that had survived, the clothes on their backs, and the book that had cost them everything. As they were about to ride out, Jackson walked over to the small, scorched patch of ground where 2 wooden crosses stood. He knelt, placing the little wooden horse on the earth of Thomas's grave. "I know now, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know why you sent him. It's all right. The debt will be paid. You can rest now." A gentle breeze stirred the ashes, and for a moment, just a moment, Jackson thought he heard the faint sound of a child's laughter. He stood up and walked back to Margot and Nashota. He looked at the woman with sunset hair, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes brighter and more determined than ever. He looked at the Apache boy, the messenger from another world, whose quiet courage had saved them all. They were a strange, broken family, forged in fire and grief. But they were a family. "It's a long ride to Santa Fe," Jackson said, looking at Margot. "That's where the territorial governor is, the only man with the power to challenge Finch." A slow smile spread across Margot's face. "Then we'd better get started." They rode east, away from the smoking ruins of Jackson's life, toward an uncertain future. They were no longer running. They were hunting. And their prey was the most powerful man in Arizona. It was a fool's errand, a suicide mission. 3 people against an empire. But Jackson Weatherby was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a father with a score to settle. And he had a message from his son, a promise to keep, and a debt to pay in full. The fire had taken his past, but it had given him a future. A future filled with justice. And maybe, just maybe, a second chance at life. The story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If you enjoyed this story, and you want to know how Jackson finally brings down the man who murdered his son, don't forget to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss how this ends.